I think I was trying to, in fiction, speak to all the different people from all the different walks of life who are impacted. No one comes out unscathed.
Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, to our listeners, this episode is going to air on January 23rd when, oh my God, holy shit, Trump will be in office at that point. But we are taping in the pleasant, semi-pleasant before times, Saturday, January 18th, and the inauguration hasn't happened yet. And I'm saying all of this about the timeline because I also want you to know where this conversation falls on the timeline of the Los Angeles wildfires.
Those fires started last week and have caused, as I'm sure everyone knows, record-setting damage with some 10,000 structures burned and 27 people killed, according to a recent piece in the New York Times. Entire neighborhoods have been decimated, and if you've seen the footage of what it looks like to fly into LAX, well, you know what that looks like. The Washington Post says that more than 150,000 people were displaced last week as they were fleeing from these fires.
And it seems like things are still changing every day. About 170,000 people are still under evacuation orders and warnings, and high-speed winds are expected to pick up again next week. So this is an ongoing and unprecedented situation with fires damaging or destroying major neighborhoods, including the Pacific Palisades and the historically Black town of Altadena, which both of those areas just horribly affected, with potentially more devastation to come.
You're in Minneapolis, I'm in Kansas City. But even at a distance, and this has been shocking and terrifying and frightening to watch. And I feel like I'm getting little pictures, I just don't feel like I have a sense of the scale of what's happening in California right now.
So we decided to invite an expert to join us and share her perspective. Sarah S. Grossman is a writer and former reporter at HuffPost, where she covered the climate crisis and other social justice issues. Her novel, A Fire So Wild, which is about a group of people connected by a wildfire in California, came out in February 2024. Born and raised in New York City, she now lives in Los Angeles. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. When did you move to LA?
Just a couple of years ago now, July 2022.
Are you like, wow, this was a great decision?
Yes, I love
Okay,
LA.
good.
I love LA maybe even more on the other side of this.
Maybe you could tell us about what part of the city you live in. It's a very large city, and how you and friends and loved ones are faring during these fires.
Yeah, so I live in Venice, which is on the city's west side. It's a couple neighborhoods over from the Palisades, which is one of the neighborhoods that was most impacted by the fires. I have close family friends who lost their home of 30 years in the Palisades, and some friends in Santa Monica who've had to evacuate. Um, I think everyone in the city is pretty shaken, and I will say everyone very quickly came together to support one another in this. I mean, folks were checking on each other, offering up their homes to one another when there were evacuations to make sure folks were okay. There's been a huge mutual aid push in volunteers and in donation efforts. And recovery is a very long road, and those who are most impacted are going to be facing this for years to come. But the city has really pulled through, and I think we're all just grateful to be here and be able to support one another through this.
Could you just see the fires driving around or walking outside your house? I mean, what was the experience like where you are right now,
Yeah. So the fires here in the Palisades were in the Santa Monica Mountains, so I could see them out my window. I have one window that faces south and the other one that faces north directly onto the Santa Monica Mountains. So yeah, a friend who had evacuated the Santa Monica area, which was under an evacuation mandatory order, was at my house, and we were up all night looking out the window, seeing the flames as they progressed and following the evacuation orders as they moved closer in. And at one point, there was a third fire that ignited in Runyon Canyon near the Hollywood area. And so there was a huge surprise evacuation flood in the middle of the city that was ended up being a ton of traffic with folks trying to get out all at the same time. And so all of LA has been impacted by this. And I think every area, including the Valley, had eyes on one fire or another that was approaching them. It's been a scary 10 days. Clear now. The air is cleared of smoke as well, which we're grateful for.
Oh, wow. So you're talking to us from your home in Venice today.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you're able to be there. And in terms of the larger lay of the land across LA, the two biggest fires that I keep hearing about are Palisades and Eaton, but there are so many smaller ones. So how many are there now, and which neighborhoods have been the most affected, and which places kind of remain at risk? Because I know there's still evacuation warnings and watches and et cetera in place for about 170,000 people, I think.
Yeah. So the place that it's at now is that the two biggest fires, the Palisades here on the west side, and then the Eaton fire on the east side, which took out a large swath of Altadena, which is a historically Black working to middle class neighborhood that was heavily impacted. They lost 17 people there. In the Palisades, they lost 10 people. Those fires are largely contained, so about 43% contained to 73% contained, which means that they're not at huge risk for spread right now. The firefighters are working to get those to be smaller and smaller, and are actually looking to repopulate those areas. A lot of the mandatory evacuations that are still underway now are because these sites are toxic. After a fire, you have ash everywhere, and anything that you can think of that makes up a home is now in bits suspended in the air. It's also in your water systems. And so there are folks in those neighborhoods who are not able to access clean water. So this is a longer term recovery effort that officials are trying to figure out when it's safe for folks to come back in, even to assess the damage to their properties and figure out what the steps are to rebuild, because that is a long and not easy road as well.
I guess so. There were the midweek this past Wednesday, there was a high wind. So those winds have died down now. Is that making it easier? Is that why we're seeing more containment?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest threats when there is what's called a red flag warning, or conditions where fire can spread really easily, are these very high winds, which can take embers from a small fire and traveling across very dry vegetation. We haven't seen significant rains in this region for something like 10 months. So that's, when we talk about what are the conditions for fire spread, it was January, which is not a month that is considered a high fire season month. And yet this is global warming. Every year it gets worse, and every month now is a high fire season month for LA.
So yes, the winds, the dryness, and global warming seems to me to be clearly the primary problems here, but the internet does not think that. On social media, I want to find people to blame. And there have been a ton of conspiracies about this, whether there were arson conspiracy theories. There have been lots of people who are criticizing Mayor Karen Bass of LA for not being prepared, or for being away right when the fire started. Maybe you could just talk to us about what the government response has been in your estimation, and how LA people are thinking about the way the government has responded to this fire.
Look, I think there are a lot of factors here. I will say, when it comes to pointing the finger at individuals and arson, I think we are missing the point. It doesn't matter how the fire starts when you have conditions like this that can spread it to be this deadly and this destructive. And a lot of what we saw in fires up in Northern California, where I used to live before this, was that there would be suspicions of arson, and then there would be a larger investigation, and it would turn out that it was a PG&E line that had fallen, that wasn't maintained, and that had sparks on the ground and then spread, regardless of whether it was a person who accidentally or intentionally did it, or if it was one of these larger corporations that should be maintaining their power lines better and hasn't. We'll see. But the bigger piece to point a finger at is the climate crisis, and who's to blame there are the corporations who continue to consume and release carbon emissions that heat our planet, governments that aren't doing enough to reduce greenhouse gases. I mean, if you want to be angry at someone, you should be angry at wealthy people, billionaires who continue to consume, at big ag, who are consuming water and destroying our environment. And when it comes to government, the way they're approaching fire, they're doing a little better in California, but not nearly enough at looking at indigenous ancestral practices for how you relate to the land, that is not stripping it away, that is not prevention above using other practices that help maintain the sort of equilibrium between the humans and the trees. There is a lot that needs to be done, but I wouldn't be looking at like arson and looting. I think that's a way to keep our eyes small and not on the big picture of who really needs to be addressing this larger, longer term crisis, not just for California, but for our whole planet.
But I mean, the government has, I mean, at present, there are police, et cetera, deployed to prevent looting, for example. Like that is something that they have prioritized. Can you talk a little bit about what that situation is? Like, are you seeing, I don't know how close you can even get to a neighborhood where, right, that has been devastated in this way, but they're deploying police to protect property?
Yeah, and I think that response is disappointing. I don't think our concern really should be about what ends up being often in these situations, folks who are impacted and under resourced and looking to see what they have access to, and maybe not able to find that in a sufficient government response. Another thing about the government response that we should be paying attention to in California is that a lot of the firefighters on the front lines here are incarcerated firefighters. They're about 30 to 40% of our firefighting force, and they are wildly underpaid. And when they then are released because of their records, they're not able to work as firefighters. And so there's a lot to look at in the government response that needs fixing, but I don't know that what I would encourage is more police to protecting property as a priority.
One of the things that seems really unusual about these fires is also, right, that they're fires in a city. And so, I mean, I live in Minneapolis. I grew up in Maryland, and where I grew up in suburban Maryland, houses are pretty far apart from each other. And here in Minneapolis, I'm looking out the window. I can see my next door neighbor's house. It can't be like it's 30 feet tops. So there's like really not a lot of space. So I can just imagine, looking at his roof and my roof, our roofs are not far apart. So like, how is just sort of the fact that this is an urban fire in some ways, like it's going from the trees to the houses and back. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're talking about a couple neighborhoods, so the Palisades on the west side and Altadena on the east side, that are neighborhoods that have plots of land that are very close to one another. This is not like big rural sprawl. This is small, like 1 to 2 story houses, maybe with small yards around them in some cases, pretty close together. What that looks like when a fire is spreading, I will say, were it not for the climate crisis, these are not considered necessarily super high risk areas. What you would expect is for a fire to spread through vegetation, which it did here in the Palisades and the Santa Monica Mountains, but to sort of be able to stop when it meets road, when it meets other houses. It's not as easy to spread when you don't have these high wind, very dry conditions that we saw here. What happened here is similar to what happened up in the Santa Rosa, so Sonoma and Napa area in 2017, and then again in Paradise, which was the deadliest fire in the state in 2019, which is neighborhoods that were not expected to be high fire risk. The fire had taken up so much power and so much speed that it was barreling through these areas at some rates up in Santa Rosa at the rate of a football field per minute. And so the way to get ahead of that is with evacuation warnings and mandatory evacuations, which I will say here in LA were well done in the sense that a lot of people evacuated and got out. And that's why you see relatively fewer deaths than you did in an area like Paradise, which had like 87 people die, versus here you had 10 in the Palisades and 17 in Altadena. Every death from this is preventable, to be clear, and should not have happened. But the another factor here is that you have not native plants, so very tall palm trees, that when those light up, those embers are spreading everywhere at very high speeds. And again, that's one of the ways that we can create a relationship to our environment that has less invasive species, that has more like less fire prone vegetation, that we could be working toward in terms of the longer term view of how we continue to live in what are now, this is our reality.
So I was reading different things that seem to contradict each other. One thing that was talking about drought and how that has led to things being sort of more flammable. And then other things that were saying that there had been like actually quite a lot of precipitation, but that had been a problem. Can you clarify that for me? I was flipping back and forth between articles. I was like, I don't understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it can be confusing. Part of what happened is that this time last year, we had very heavy rains, unusually heavy rains in this area. What that meant was a relief of what had been years of drought. And so our reservoirs were able to fill back up. This is a good thing. What it also meant is that the land was responsive to these rains with a lot of growth of vegetation.
Oh, okay.
So you're now seeing areas that were parched suddenly growing a lot of vegetation that then over the next 10 months of no rain dried up. And so that is all tinder. That becomes fuel for now with the high winds, with these fire sparks, spreads into these catastrophic fire conditions.
One helpful thing would be getting people to like admit that there is climate change happening. You wrote a piece in 2022 about a global survey indicating about 30% of Americans weren't worried about climate change at all. There was other data. Sugi found a 2021 story in which a Yale poll indicates that 3 in 4 Americans do think it's happening, and they do think it's affecting us right now. So there's some variation there, but let's just assume that we all agree it's happening. Like, if we agree on that, what should happen in terms of recovery and prevention in the future? I mean, I hear a lot about, okay, we're going to rebuild there, but the insurance fund is underfunded there. And it's also last chance insurance. So normal insurance companies aren't already not insuring these houses. Are there going to be places where people just can't live anymore?
Yeah, this is a very complicated question. I will say there are a lot of folks who are very climate conscious who say that some of these areas, yes, should not be inhabited any longer because of the conditions. So rebuilding in some of these neighborhoods that essentially abut these very large state parks or like highly vegetated areas and are right against them in these like hillsides or the foothills, those are areas that are very high risk for fire, because it is very difficult for emergency personnel to get between the houses and the fire and the vegetation or the hills or the mountains that they're on. There is a question of whether people should be allowed, whether we should have regulation that limits building in those kinds of areas. Now, I think particularly in a place like the Palisades, which is quite a wealthy enclave, I don't see politicians being able to set up that kind of regulation without a huge amount of pushback from folks who want to be able to enjoy their parks and have their views of the Pacific. I don't mean to be flip for folks who have lost everything in a huge community that they've been part of for decades. These are very complicated issues. But yes, on a long-term basis, overall, as a state, as a country, we should absolutely be looking at regulating where we build and what we build to be more responsive to the climate crisis.
I'm a fan of regulation, but I just want to ask this question, like, the government did make it possible for people to get insurance in those neighborhoods, right? They stepped in to make it possible rather than saying like, hey, the market says you shouldn't be living here anymore. You're not going to have insurance and let's see what happens. I mean, is that also a potential solution to just not help when it becomes too expensive to insure homes in dangerous areas?
Yeah, I think again, it's complicated. Some of these communities, like for example, when you're looking at Altadena, this is a historically Black community, working and middle class, that has been there now for generations. When you look at the racial wealth gap in this country and housing discrimination, this is a unique community that we should be supporting people continuing to live in and thrive in. And not providing insurance to folks, I don't think is the solution. I think new building and new construction should be regulated and limited, because what you don't want is to have more people and more development in these areas. What I'm most concerned about, frankly, now is in an area like Altadena, similar to in Maui after those fires last year, which were also out of season, unexpected, devastating, is seeing corporations sort of buy up what then becomes cheap land, and then those areas being really heavily gentrified, and seeing the important culture of those communities completely disappear. That's of concern to me in LA.
That's interesting. My family is Sri Lankan, and post tsunami, that was definitely something that we saw happening, particularly at coastal areas where it's at a premium.
Mm.
Um, I'm curious about, like, we're talking a little bit about like new building versus old building, and it seemed to me like from what I was reading that one of the things that was difficult here was that a lot of the neighborhoods that did burn that weren't expected to burn were also older construction, so they weren't subject to like the kind of, I think, like 2008 era regulation of like essentially buildings being built with less flammable materials and in more secure ways. Like, do you think it's plausible or like desirable to go back and try and fix older housing that's in high risk areas? Is that like financially, is that even plausible?
I mean, there's some efforts to do this in existing areas. I know that, for example, of just making existing housing more fire resilient. I know when I was living in Berkeley, up in the Berkeley Hills, there were new regulations that were set into place where you had to be um, sort of cutting the vegetation regularly around your area, cutting down dead trees. There were eucalyptus groves that they were trying to remove because those are, again, invasive species, highly flammable. And there's a sort of like perimeter that you can set up around your home that doesn't have vegetation, that allows fire emergency personnel to get in. It makes it less likely for a fire to spread. These are mitigating factors. I think they're not, you know, total solutions when a fire like this, if a fire like this were to come, as I cover in my book, over the hills behind Berkeley and through those neighborhoods, this wouldn't stop that. But anything we can do helps. I interviewed a climate scientist around what individuals can do in the face of the climate crisis, which is really at the scale of government and corporation to be solving for. And they said at this point, it's all hands on deck. So whatever you can do in your home, in your community, do it.
Well, let's talk about that novel, A Fire So Wild, which is set in Berkeley, as you mentioned. Um, what about your reporting experiences made you interested in writing about fire? Seems prescient now, obviously, and why Berkeley? Um, and how did you imagine, like, figure out, okay, how big am I going to make the fire, and how does the size of the fire in your novel compare with what we're seeing today?
Yeah. So this book was written in 2021. So I had moved to the Bay in 2017. And the weekend that I moved to San Francisco was a historic heat wave. San Francisco was seeing temperatures over 100 degrees that it never sees. And a month later, you saw the Sonoma and Napa fires, which at the
Hmm.
time were among the deadliest. I went up and did reporting for HuffPost, where I worked as a reporter at the time, on the immediate aftermath in the days after the fire in Santa Rosa. And it was eerily similar to what you see here, which is entire neighborhoods turned to ash. These are swaths, block after block of houses that have been turned to dust. And again, 2 years later, the same thing happened in Paradise. At that point, at even higher rate of deaths, so 87 people died in Paradise. The entire town was razed. And a lot of people died trying to evacuate because it was a very small and narrow road in and out. And having covered both of those, that one I covered in the months following, so not the immediate aftermath, but what recovery looks like months later for these communities. Both of those were heavily on my mind as I wrote, what ended up being a novel. I think I was trying to, in fiction, speak to all the different people from all the different walks of life who are impacted. No one comes out unscathed from the climate crisis. And what that looks like here in California is a fire season that's spreading and worsening. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do? How are we going to show up for one another through this?
Would you read a little bit from the book for us?
Sure. Happy to. So this passage is about halfway through the novel. The fire has just hit and passed, and we are with a family, Abigail and her wife Taylor, who are waiting at the hospital with their son Xavier. He and his friend Mar had to flee the fire when it hit their neighborhood in Berkeley. The fire had stopped where they always said it would, on Shattuck Avenue, where the wide 4-lane thoroughfare left enough berth for the flames to lick across but not catch, enough space for a dozen fire trucks to line up and form a wall. The firefighters, exhausted and drenched in sweat under their full body gear, sprayed into the unforgiving blaze. After days of battling sky-high flames that leapt monstrously from treetops to rooftops and back again, the incarcerated firefighters began to wonder if it was worth it for the meager pay, the single dollar per hour, the short escape from the confines of a 6-by-8-foot cell, to be suffocated like this, to hover so close to death. It was under their persistent efforts that the flames were finally calmed, reduced to a smolder, then contained. The houses behind their line of defense, whose insurance was priced lower for just this reason, were spared. But the 15 by 10 block stretch from Marin to Loma Avenues, once a maze of towering Victorians, lush citrus trees, and worn out swing sets, had become a field of ash. The sheer speed of the fire's descent caught officials by surprise, how it barreled down the 2-mile stretch of hill in less than an hour. Climate change, they said, shaking their heads, a gesture that absolved many and satisfied few. Sitting in the hospital waiting room, Taylor's heart was racing from the last 12 hours. Even inside the sterile space, she could still smell a faint odor of burnt, like something had rotted on the inside of her nostrils, lingered there, a reminder of what they'd survived. She kept replaying the moment she realized Xavier was still inside the house, behind a wall of flames beyond her reach. It was a torture unlike anything she'd ever experienced, the knowledge that her boy was suffering, and mere feet away, she couldn't get to him. Then, like a twisted angel fallen from the sky, his body came hurtling through the flames, landing with a splash in the pool. As Xavier swam, gasping to the edge, Abigail came running down from the other house. As soon as she saw him, Abigail burst into tears, quite unhelpfully, Taylor thought. Mar, still soaking wet in her bra, helped Taylor to shoulder Xavier, limping and coughing, to the back of the car, where he vomited and then lay still. They drove downhill, through narrow one-way streets. With the power out, the only light came from the blaze at their backs. The cars moved at an infernally slow pace, trapped in a long line of neighbors trying to evacuate, honking desperately and uselessly at one another. Mar held Xavier's head in her lap, stroking his hair. Taylor glanced in the rearview mirror, felt a twinge of envy that those weren't her fingers, tracing comfort across her son's brow. At one point, a man with threadbare clothes and a wild look in his eyes came running down, banging on the windows of the cars behind them. When no one let him in, he continued his race away from the flames. Taylor felt a wave of relief that he hadn't tried to get into their car. She didn't know if she would have opened the doors. As they inched toward the hospital, she prayed silently, suddenly quite religious in her desperation. Lord, if you let us survive this, I will do anything. I'll never doubt you again. I'll be grateful for my life every day. I won't leave, Abigail. Just please let us make it through this night.
Thank you very much. Um, Scary. But also,
Yes.
I mean, in the Palisades in particular, wasn't it also difficult to get out of there and the same sort of situation where people were on narrow roads, hard to escape the area? I mean, that traffic issue is not a small thing when you're dealing with a fire.
No, it's a very intense, very big problem. Where we saw it, we saw some of that in the Palisades, yes, which has a few roads that lead out to what is then PCH, which is the main Pacific Coastal Highway, which also saw a ton of houses burn upward toward Malibu. You could see people fleeing, videotaping as they were in their car with the flames coming down toward them. You don't have another option to get out of these places. You're in your car, and people left their cars in the road when
I
they
saw
saw
that.
that the flames were coming. Um, these are very difficult circumstances to know whether it's safe to leave your house, when to leave, how to leave, and once you're fleeing, whether it's smarter to stay in your car as the flames are approaching on the off chance that the road clears and you can get out, or to flee on foot. What ends up happening is that people who flee on foot leave their cars, which then block other people from leaving. So, yeah, these are really dangerous, harrowing, and deadly circumstances.
And one of the things that there's in an earlier scene, a lot of the characters who were introduced in the beginning of the book are all gathered at a party that this character Abigail, who's mentioned in your reading, is having to raise money for affordable housing, but in a very rich house, you know. And you have all the different classes of people of in that in the party, which speaks to this idea that no one's going to escape this, right? Being wealthy is not going to be protection from this. But what's interesting is like they've been seeing smoke. They're aware that there's some fire going on, and they are really slow to react because in some ways this has become normalized. Is that what you were aiming for in that scene?
Yeah, a couple things happen when a fire is approaching your area. One of the things that has happened here that I saw a lot up in Northern California and lived through myself as a resident is that there is a sort of steady normalcy to fire season. You get used to there being fires nearby, but not close enough for you to evacuate, that you're sort of keeping a watchful eye on. There's smoke in the air. Is it so much smoke that you're putting on a mask? Do you have to get an air purifier? There's a sort of constant air of risk without knowing whether you're doing quite enough. You have a go bag. Is it with you in your car every time you leave the house? Maybe not. You start to become sort of casual around these things in a way that then can be really detrimental when these fires do get close to your home and your neighborhood. I experienced some of that myself here in Venice. I live alone and have a dog, and it is not necessarily easy for me to go with a 60-pound pit bull to stay with other friends. And I was making those kinds of calculations. If the evacuation line gets, up to the 10, then maybe I'll go to my friends and just like, lock my dog in one of their rooms. And if it gets like further out, then actually maybe my home is maybe a haven for someone else to come to. You're making these calculations, basically staying up all night trying to see what the progression of the fire is, both out your window and
I mean,
on
that's the other thing. What
apps.
happens if it progresses while you're sleeping? You can't, it can just come, you
You don't
know?
sleep much. Yeah.
Mm.
So Whitney is mentioning this party. It's a really, I mean, from the point of view of structure, like narratively speaking, it's a really good setup for a very kind of organic unfolding of these clashing sets of politics. Right. Abigail's throwing the party and kind of in a virtue signally, but also like heartfelt way is trying to do some good in a limited space. One of the servers at the party, Willow, like meets Abigail, thinks she's getting invited to the party and instead is invited to work at the party. There's a divorced couple that's at the party and they're kind of passive aggressively, well, maybe just aggressive aggressively fighting with each other kind of about their class differences and responses to climate change. And it's their daughter who is Mar, and Mar has a friend, Lena, who talks to her about how indigenous people indigenous practices include these controlled burns to prevent wildfires. He managed to get all of that in there, and it is all very character based. And
It's
I
also
really
very
appreciated.
California-y.
It's like craft wise, it's like a really, it seems like a lot of very smart choices that also fit with this particular setting. Can you talk a little bit about like how this evolved for you, like through drafts? Like, were there characters that you were like, I haven't represented this side of politics, so I'm going to introduce this character? Anything like that you can give us some insight into?
Yeah, of course. I had the privilege of living in the Bay for a while, and I was living in Berkeley when I wrote this book. And so a lot of these characters are born of the communities that I was lucky enough to be part of. And there were specific walks of life that I wanted to make sure to include based on the reporting I had done over years in California on fires. And including in California, you're not looking at just the climate crisis in a vacuum, but you're looking at a climate crisis that is on top of what we have as an affordable housing crisis. And so I wanted to make sure to include everyone who's going to be impacted by this. So it is not only the wealthy family who live in the nice house up in the hills, it is also this couple, one of whom is living in affordable housing in the flats, and it is the folks who are unhoused, who are living out of their van, and who are parked near the party when this happened. And those are all based, each of the characters is based on folks that I had spoken to in my coverage after the fires in Santa Rosa and in Paradise, and in some of my coverage around the housing crisis, and just trying to weave together what is our reality, which is we're all in community with one another here in Venice. I have the great privilege of volunteering at Safe Place for Youth, and a lot of the young people who are unhoused who come in for services there, I see around the neighborhood, and we say hey, and we're all part of one another's lives in this way. And they were very differently impacted than I was by these fires, meaning when they are sleeping rough, they are exposed to the smoke in a way that I'm not when I'm able to shut the windows and doors in my house. These are all things that I thought were important to tell if you're going to be telling a story of a wildfire impacting a community in California today.
We're all in this. I mean, that would be great if perhaps people could learn from these situations that we are, in fact, all in this together. My concern is that the wealthy are going to learn the lesson that we need our own private fire service, like some guy on Twitter was famously asking for, and we're just going to save ourselves, and we don't care about the rest of y'all.
Yeah, the wealthy are going to do what they're going to do. What we need to do is respond to them as constituents with a government who hopefully can tax the wealthy to then redistribute some of those funds to support the rest of society. And what we saw out of here in LA with these fires was a huge mutual aid effort. I mean, quite literally, Mutual Aid LA, who have been working on the ground for years in mutual aid efforts with community fridges and other ways of providing resources to the unhoused, got together like this to put together volunteer efforts to match folks who had things to donate to other folks who were evacuated and needed things, and have set up a whole spreadsheet in which you could, donate to GoFundMe's of folks out in Altadena who need support for their recovery. You could figure out a place that was having volunteer efforts on Sunday afternoon if you had time to give but no resources. This has been a huge ground up grassroots effort to show up for one another. And that's what we need. And what continues to happen, regardless of what the wealthy are going to do in response to this, is communities are showing up for one another who are most vulnerable.
That's great. Well, thank you, Sarah, so much for joining us. And we will link to some of the articles that Sarah wrote in the past, some of the fundraisers that were just mentioned. And of course, listeners, you can find A Fire So Wild at an independent bookstore near you. Sarah, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.